Well, 41 Kelshik last week. I didn't get now, no? They were behind.
Daily Rambam for Monday, Chaf El Tavshin Pei, Perek Chamishi, the fifth Perek of Hilchis Tefillah and Berachas Kohanim. So in the last year, in Perek Beis of Hilchis Tefillah, we learned about the various changes and additions you have to Shemona Esrei, to your basic Shemona Esrei. So for example, the whole bracha, Berachas Haminim. We learned about Havinenu, shortening the whole middle of Shemona Esrei. We learned about the middle bracha of Shabbos and Yom Tov, Musaf Rosh Hashanah, davening on Yom Kippur, adding Hashem Svasei Tiftach at the beginning and Yul Ratzin at the end, Yal V'Yavai, Musaf of Rish Chodesh, saying Vataydienu on Yom Tov at Matzah Shabbos, adding Nisim, Anenu, Nachem, Merid Atol, Merid Agashem, Saint Halamater, in Eretz Yisrael, or in Bavel, Hamalach HaKadosh, Hamalach HaMishpat, Naser Semeit Shuvah, and adding Zechreinu L'chaim and all the rest in Shemona Esrei, and we also learned about adding the Ubechains in Ata Kodesh. Whether just in Yom Neroim or some had the minhag to even add it in Naser Semeit Shuvah. Perek Gimel, the Perek of Shabbos, was about Zman Tefillah, the different Zmanim regarding Tefillah, and also regarding Tashlumin. If you need to make up, you missed the davening, can you make it up by davening twice, etc. Also, if you have Musaf and Mincha, what comes first? Perek Dalet of Sunday dealt with the 5 things that are Ma'akiv Tefillah, the 5 things that are so important that you can't start davening without them, and that is purity of the hands, Taras Yadayim, and Kisui Ha'erva, making sure one's nakedness is covered, that the Taras Makam HaTefillah, the place where you're davening is tar, there's nothing really awful there, making sure things aren't distracting you, and the Kavanah, basic kavana, those are 5 things you must have. And now we arrived at Perek Hey, where in this case the Rambam is going to really. That's a whole discussion which we would have discussed if we would have been learning Perek Daled. That's Chaim Brisker has a famous vart that you need to have Daled Nemi Atoime, the whole davening, and then Pirush Hamilos for prior davening. The Rebbe said different things about it different times. We mentioned it a bit when we did Perek Daled of Hilchas Kriya Shema about today we don't have kavana. What does that mean? And the Rambam is Chaim Brisker is on the Rambam, so the Rambam says one thing here, one thing later on. Anyway, but now we're in Perek Hey, and in this case, the Rambam is going to introduce everything we need to know about the Perek for us. We don't have to introduce anything ourselves. Right here in Halacha Aleph, so let's see what the Rambam says in his introduction. Halacha Aleph, Shemayna Dvarim, Tzarech HaMispal, Yizor B'hen L'Asayis, and there are 8 things someone davening has to be careful with and do. But if something went wrong, something was pushing him, he was forced, or he just didn't do it. And the davening is still a davening. It doesn't mean that it wasn't a davening. They are the following 8: Amida, standing, Hamikdash, facing the Beis Hamikdash, Tikkun HaGuf, making sure your body is arranged properly, Tikkun HaMalbush, your clothing are arranged properly, Tikkun HaMakim, the places is arranged properly, Shivayas HaKoil, modulating your voice, making sure you're projecting at the right tone, Kriya, V'Ashtach Havaya, we're going to see at the end what Kriya and Ashtach Havaya are, bowing and prostration, as we shall see. And now the rest of the parak is divided by these 8 things, and each thing, and I'm going to say, Amida Keitzad, Noichach HaMikdash Keitzad, etc. The Halacha Beis, Amida Keitzad, so what's the standing, what does that involve? So Rambam says, Ein Mispalin Ela Me'umad. First of all, you need to be standing when you're davening. That's basics, right? Now that I'm immediately, we said that all these things are not ma'akiv, so in some of them, Rambam is actually going to say clearly, cases and scenarios where it's not where we say okay you don't have to do it. So if someone's traveling on a boat or a wagon, you can stand them lav. If you can't stand, so sit and down. Someone who's ill, mispal afilu sheikhem al tzidai can daven even while lying on his side. As long as he has the ability for kavana, which is the other issue we already mentioned in the previous parak. You need to have kavana. So and then you have someone who's thirsty or hungry. Now, this is not really related to standing. Someone who's ill, so he mentions this halacha as well over here. Someone who's hungry or thirsty, they are also included in the category of those who are ill. If you have the ability to focus, so then if not, then you should eat and drink first. We'll discuss that in a bit. If you're riding on an animal, even if there's someone who can hold your animal for you, don't go down. Better to sit where you are in davening. You'll be more relaxed and calmer while sitting on your animal than while off your animal and someone's holding it for you. What's going on? Yeah. Now, regarding the chayla, so the Kesef Mishnah quotes from Rabbeinu Menayach that we're saying only if the chayla, like sheyush yach l'chavon is daita. If you can't be mechaven, if you can't concentrate, better not to. However, we already learned last week in Hilchos Kriya Shema about the whole idea that a lot of the halachas about not davening, better not to daven if you don't have kavana. We're in this battle because we don't have kavana anyway, meaning that the bar, the minimum, was lowered a lot, and the default is we don't have any expectations that anyone will have tremendous kavana in the first place. Doesn't mean that we're not discouraging kavana. Of course, we encourage it. We still have we still talk about very high levels of kavana, but just for the average person, we don't assume that your level is that high. So probably anyone could daven, even what we're talking about here. Maybe also added that same goes for a zaken, an old person. If he can't stand, so he should sit and daven. And it says that if he's sitting, but he can stand up for where you bow, so then so you stand up there and you sit back down, stand up to bow. Now with all these halachas here in Rambam, there are a lot of additional details, as we already saw last week in Shulchan Aruch and Shulchan Aruch Alter Rebbe. Can't do everything from the whole parak, but at least more towards the beginning of the parak. I'll quote a few more. So in Shulchan Aruch Siman Tzadik Daled, elaborates on these halachas. Someone's riding on a donkey, you don't have to get off, even if someone can grab it for you, on the ship or on the wagon, all of that. And even if you're walking, it adds, even if you're walking, mispal derech hiluchay, afilu shlei b'makom sakan, even if there's no danger in stopping, and Alter Rebbe adds in Shulchan Aruch, even if you're going for a dvar rishus, it's not like you're going for any special reason. Because if you're walking or you're on the way somewhere and then you have to suddenly stop and daven, you're going to feel upset. I'm not getting where I need to go. It's just going to adversely affect your davening anyway. So it's better to daven while you're walking. It's all subjective. It all really depends on the details. Alter Rebbe adds that if you're actually ahead, let's say you're in a caravan and you actually ran ahead of them. Now you have to wait 5 minutes for them to catch up to you. And someone could hold your animal for you there. Then you can go down and daven, and now you're waiting for them. You're not distracted. Shulchan Aruch adds that yesh machmirin in these situations that you should at least stand up for the first bracha of davening. Now it says lamed ba'avis. Now if you look at the Alter Rebbe, though, it seems like the Alter Rebbe doesn't understand lamed here to mean standing. It seems like the Alter Rebbe understands lamed to mean to stop walking. We're still talking about the person who's walking. The yesh machmirin lamed ba'avis. You should stop and stand in one place for the first bracha. Because the Alter Rebbe adds, if you're davening while you're walking, you can't have so much kavana. So therefore, keep your animal. So shouldn't walk for one bracha, and you don't even have to get off of it. So you're not actually standing; you're just pausing. So if you're on an animal, pause your animal. So nowadays, the equivalent would be in a vehicle. Now, if you're driving the vehicle, so the place can say, driving a vehicle, you shouldn't be davening because you really need to be concentrating on the road. And what kind of kavana can you have if you're either the driving's not good or the davening's not good? One of the two. Right, so none of the options are good. So not sitting, not driving, but if you're sitting in a car, so similar. I mean, if you can't stand up, you daven while you're sitting. Similarly, if you're on a plane or on a bus, it all depends on the circumstances, whether it's appropriate to stand up or not, whether it's going to cause problems. But like we said, a car lafi adarach lafi amakom. Oh, if that's your minig, then
It's only allowed, yeah.
Right. And so you're supposed to. You really should stand at least for if you again standing, not meaning standing up. At least to pause. Let's say you're driving a car. Let's say you can't get out of the car. It doesn't make sense to get out of the car. You're on the highway. At least to pull over and sit in one place for office and then continue driving if there's no sakana. Then the Alter Rebbe adds that really you should really arrange your schedule, that you should daven before you leave, or schedule that you'll arrive and you'll be able to daven. That's a whole separate halacha about all of that. What if you're on the road already? So now, unless you do have time, the Zman Tefillah arrived, but now, so should you daven now with Zman Tefillah, or should you wait till you get there? A whole discussion. Additionally, in Shulchan Aruch, so it talks about that if you can stand up, at least for the bowing, you should stand up for that. Or if you can stand up for the 3 steps, to take the 3 steps back, you should stand up for that. And in the Shulchan Aruch had something interesting. Let's say you're on an animal, and so how are you going to take 3 steps back? It says you should make the animal take 3 steps back. I don't know if that works with the car also, back up a bit, but that's what Shulchan Aruch says. That there's something to backing your animal up to do the 3 steps. Then you have the din of the zaken and the chayla in the Shulchan Aruch. So the Rebbe adds about the zaken that who can't stand should sit, and the chayla should either sit or lie on his side. And the Shulchan Aruch adds that if he can't daven, it's still he should go through davening in his mind. Yahar, you should think, go through it. The Alter Rebbe adds, even though you're not actually being yaitza by thinking, as we'll see in Siman Kuf Aleph, but there's still some value to going through it. He says, if you can't have kavanah, at least the first pasuk of Kriya Shema, surely even a very sick person who's conscious should be able to, first pasuk of Kriya Shema. Shulchan Aruch adds, what if you have goyim all over and you're afraid they're going to interrupt your day? You're going to stop, you're going to start davening, and then they're going to start interrupting you, or you're going to lose your business somehow. So then you can also sit and daven, because you're not going to be davening properly anyway while you're standing and all nervous. And if you stand up for the 3 steps or for bowing or whatever. Another point about standing is to make sure you're not leaning on something and you're standing near a table, near an amud. If you have koyach, if you don't have koyach, it's a different story. But if you have the koyach, you're not supposed to be leaning on another object. That's not proper standing. And Shulchan Aruch adds that if you were forced to daven while sitting, it's actually recommended you should daven while standing when you arrive at your destination. And you don't even have to add anything to Tfilas Nedava. There's one more halacha, and I'll bring it the way the Alter Rebbe says it. Interesting halacha. Someone's on the road and he arrives, and there are no Jewish hotels. He arrives at a non-Jewish hotel. Now, especially back in Europe, there were a lot of icons, Christian iconography, whatever it is, whether it's crosses or other things, all over the place. So the question is, should you be davening? You could either daven outside in the middle of nowhere, or you could daven inside, but it's going to be near this stuff. So it says, if you're going to go off the road and daven in a spot where no one's going to, you're standing there, people are going to say, hey, what are you doing? Or they're going to walk past you and distract. So if you can find a quiet spot off the side of the road, it's better to daven on the side of the road than to go into the guy's house with all that stuff. There are all these abominable things. And really, you shouldn't be bringing a davar shebekdusha there. It says, Moshe Rabbeinu with Parai. Moshe Rabbeinu said he wanted to daven, so he didn't daven in Mitzrayim. He said he had to leave Mitzrayim. Ketseisi Yasa'ir. For this reason. But if there's no good spot on the road, you'll get people are going to run you over, or something's going to happen, there's no good spot, then you should daven in the non-Jewish hostel or whatever it is in some corners so that people don't distract you. And then, no, you don't have to worry about the gilulim. Why? Everywhere we daven, it's all over the place. I mean, that's not as extreme necessarily here and now, but apparently, at least at some points, in some places and points in time, it was such a proliferation. There were so many crosses and stuff all over the place that the halacha was you could daven if you have no choice. You daven where you are. So that's another one of those halachas regarding eating and drinking. That halacha that Emma mentioned, derech agav, about if you're hungry and thirsty. So that's, of course, a big topic in Chabad. If you look in Beis Yosef says in Simon Peitas that the Rambam writes, so some of our they should, if they can't concentrate well, they should eat. The Torah and Simon Sadik Ches will be discussed. And we don't have kavanah nowadays anyway. I mentioned this in brief last week. That if we don't have kavanah anyway, so maybe we should be machmir now and not eat and drink. Because what's the eating and drinking helping? What's your kavanah anyway? He says no. But Beis Yosef says even though the Torah said what he said, you can still rely on the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch. It also says it that way. If you can mechav and yispal, v'mlav v'mrotza. If you want, al yispal al sheikh v'yesh. You don't have to, but if you want to. The Alter Rebbe also says that. And then the Alter Rebbe says, even now that we don't have kavanah, still you have the rishus. And of course, there have been many pulpulim written about the exact halachic parameters of the practice in Chabad, but this is certainly one way of understanding it, that it's simply based on this halacha of someone that's hungry and thirsty. Needs kavanah for davening. It says it right there in Shulchan Aruch. Okay, let's move along. Noichach HaMikdash. Halacha Gimel Noichach HaMikdash Keitzad. So you have to face the Beis Hamikdash. So if you're outside of Eretz Yisrael, so you face Eretz Yisrael. If you're in Eretz Yisrael already, face Yerushalayim. If you're in Yerushalayim, face the Mikdash. If you're in the Mikdash already, you face the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So here the Rambam makes it sound like if you're in Chutz La'aretz, it's just Eretz Yisrael. And Eretz Yisrael, face Yerushalayim. But I'll comment on that in a second. Suma, someone who's blind, someone who can't figure out what direction he's facing. If you're on a boat where I guess it's moving and turning directions, so then forget about facing any particular direction. Just feel like you're facing the Shekhinah in your mind, and that's enough. Now, the Kesef Mishnah mentions that actually in our Girsas, in the Braisa, in the Gemara, it says, sounds like you should not be facing literally. If you just go with that Girsa, this whole idea of Mizrach would be out the window. You just have to think about Eretz Yisrael. But the Rambam says clearly that not Yechavin Liba, Yechavin Panav. Otherwise, you're the same as someone who's blind. There's two different halachas here. The blind person thinks about the Shekhinah, and others actually are facing. And the Rosh says, we're not Geiris Liba, Yechavin Keneged Eretz Yisrael. And Sister Rabbeinu Yonah says that even when you're in Chutz La'aretz, don't just face Eretz Yisrael. You should be specifically facing Eretz Yisrael, Yerushalayim, the Beis Hamikdash, Kodesh HaKadoshim. All four, in each case, you should try to be facing the Kodesh HaKadoshim ultimately. The Shulchan Aruch and the Simon Tzaddik Zal after he brings the main din. So he says, what if you're facing another direction for whatever reasons? At least turn your face towards Eretz Yisrael if you're in Chutz La'aretz. Yerushalayim, if you're in Eretz Yisrael, etc. Then Ramah adds that we face Mizrach in Chutz La'aretz, at least in this side of Eretz Yisrael. Mizrach is synonymous with Eretz Yisrael. Obviously, if you live in Asia or in Australia, it's not called Mizrach, I guess. It's called Ma'ariv or whatever. It's often dark. But we call it Mizrach, of course. You hang up a sign on the wall, Mizrach. So why do we face Mizrach? So it's interesting. It's like a question. Why do we face Mizrach? Because we're in the west, so we're facing Eretz Yisrael. Then he adds, but actually you shouldn't face smack in the middle of east where the sun rises. He's like, because you also had pagans or whatever who also like facing the east for idolatrous reasons. So you should try to, it should be a little bit to the side, this way, that way. And then there's the other idea. What about Haret Salash? You want to be rich, it says you should face north. Or if you want to be wise, you should face south. So could be Mekayim that, but you should turn your face still towards Mizrach. The Alter Rebbe adds that that's why the Aron Kodesh, Lachin Koivim Aron HaKodesh B'Mizrach, that's why we set the shul up the way we do, because we're supposed to be facing in that direction. Then he says, what if the Aron is on the wrong wall? You should still face Mizrach and not the Aron. And he adds, the countries that we're in, Eastern Europe, is a lot more to the north. So even though we're west of Eretz Yisrael, so he says the same halacha as the Ramah, but not for the same reason. He doesn't say because of the minim. He says we should be turning southeast simply because we want to be more on point. We want to be facing Eretz Yisrael more accurately. He gives a whole cheshbon, and he ends off a cheshbon zekal la yerdim darchei cheshbon b'mishulish kaduri. Very easy calculation for those who know trigonometry. Now, from the Ramah, it seems like that the Ramah made it sound like we just generally face these. We're not actually getting too into the details, and we're just making sure not to face smack in the middle because of the minim. Now, to that, it sounds like we should be doing calculations. Now, it seems like nowadays we're not. It doesn't seem very common to make those kinds of calculations. Often, the shuls are just designed based on the direction of the streets. The streets are, some neighborhoods are like this, some neighborhoods are like that. The houses are aligned with the streets are aligned with the neighborhood, so the walls are aligned with that. So you just pick a wall, whichever wall seems the most Mizrach-like. Also, sometimes you take the size of the building into account. If it's very long and narrow, can you really put the Aron at such a small wall? You have a lot of these types of calculations. Also, there's the issue of you don't want the door to be on the same side as the Aron. That's an issue as well. You really want ideally the door should be facing the Aron if possible. And sometimes you'll find in one neighborhood where somehow different shuls are technically facing different walls, although no one is necessarily more Mizrach because one is facing, partially this way, partially that way. Mizrach is somewhere in the middle. Today you can have apps on your phone that can show you with a compass if you want to stand mamish, directly towards Yerushalayim. Even that, there's different ways to calculate it. I saw an article once in Hapardis, the old Torah journal from Reb Shia Hirschhorn in Montreal. He had people had a shayla there. They're moving into a new shul. This was, I guess, in the 50s, I think. They're moving into a shul, and the entrance is from Mizrach. And by the time they make entrances on the Mizrach wall, there's not going to be any room left, really, for anything, for an Aron, people should be walking in and out while everyone's facing the door, men, women. So he has a whole pilpul about, how can we do Ma'ariv? Can we face Ma'ariv instead? And he has this funny conclusion at the end. So Hitayin is that, Ma'ariv could be okay. And he says, he had this idea. He says, hey, Europe is much closer to Eretz Yisrael, so if you have to point towards Eretz Yisrael, you would have to face east. But he says maybe in America, we're on the other side of the globe, so maybe we could face Eretz Yisrael through the Pacific. Does it really matter? We're facing through the Atlantic, we're facing through the Pacific. Either way, you get there. I think he claims that like it's mamish spot in the middle, which it's not, definitely not. The Pacific is much longer, much further away. But he says you have to know geography. I guess maybe he was talking to himself. Just an interesting discussion. And the Sfarim today talk about what extent, like I said, all the issues that I just raised. And then you have the whole halacha in Shulchan Aruch and Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch about south and north for Yachkim and Yashir. So Alter Rebbe talks about all the details. You don't want to look at your facing a totally different direction than the whole tzibur, how to do it, your feet facing one way, your face facing another way. What if you find yourself facing totally the wrong way? Alter Rebbe mentions that Yesh Min HaChacham Shem Mispalim Mechatchila L'Mayrav. Alter Rebbe actually mentions that some would face Mayrav Pnei Shashchina B'Mayrav, and some say that, and some would face any direction because the Shechina is B'chol Makim. So b'diavad, if you started facing another direction, you don't have to completely start moving your feet around to face Eretz Yisrael, Alter Rebbe says. Halacha Daled. What about the body? So you have to align your feet next to each other. You have to face down as if you're staring at the earth. You're not actually staring at the earth. Your mind is you're thinking, but your eyes are pointing in that direction. So you're facing downwards, but your mind is thinking upwards, like you're up in the heavens. You put your hands over your heart, something like this. And you stand like a servant in front of his master. You're intimidated, you're in fear. And you certainly shouldn't put your hands on your hips. That does not seem very. That doesn't seem to be showing the right amount of respect.
Your hands in your pockets.
Or your hands in your pockets, things like that, right? So in Shulchan Aruch and Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, they add that also when they say kedusha to put your feet together. Rambam didn't mention that, but it got mentioned along the way that you should put your feet together for kedusha. And of course, our minhag is even till the end of a Akel HaKadosh. I think that comes from the Lavush. Also, the Shulchan Aruch mentions that you should also walk 3 steps forward at the beginning of davening. The Rambam only mentions taking 3 steps back at the end. Shulchan Aruch mentions the idea of walking 3 steps forward, and then you have later things that say, well, you should take 3 steps back before you take 3 steps forward. So you don't just walk forward. I think the Alter Rebbe mentions that if you're just the people that are, he mentions about looking down. He says those who are staring up the whole davening. It's Kamabitim Alagag, like they're looking at the ceiling. It says Hamalachim Aligim Aleim. The Malachim laugh at them. Like, what's wrong with you? It says before davening, you should look up though at the Shemayim just to me'ur your kavana. And even in the middle of davening, if you lose your kavana, looking up at the Shemayim, especially in windows, you're supposed to be able to see the sky. If you look up at the sky, that could be helpful for your kavana. And then he talks about the hands. So he says to go like this. That's only if that's how you speak to the king. If that's in your location, Mamakim Shenoigim Lamed the Kain Lefnei HaMelech. So it's just a way of seeming submissive. But he says there are 2 other minhagim. Some put their thumb inside their hand, maybe both like this or something, and some I think something like this. And those 2 are from the Ramah Mifano in Italy. He brings one is from the Ramak, one is from the Arizal. These are more Kabbalistic ideas, but Sfarim today say it all really depends on what's normal in your location. Don't overdo it. Halacha hey. The first one in Shulchan Aruch was like this. The second one that I mentioned was something like this. Your thumb is in your. We have to move on here though. Hey, taking a mal b'shketzer your clothing. The takim al bushim b'tchilam b'tzayin out from mahadr. So first of all, you have to just arrange all your clothing and be nice. Shem mishtach Hashem hadras kodesh. Bow to Hashem and look beautiful. You shouldn't stand for davening when you're afundasai. What's an afundasai? So the common explanation is like something like a fanny pack. You have a pouch of money on your waist or any sort of pocketbook like that. And in Latin, apparently, a funda is something like a sling, so that seems to be that kind of idea. However, the Rambam actually in Pirush HaMishnah seems to understand that it's an undershirt, and that fits in with the rest of the things. He says, not on bare head, it's not bare feet. So a fundas can fit in with that. You're not fully your bare arms or whatever. You should not bare feet if it's not acceptable to walk around without covering your feet. And the Kesef Mishnah mentions that, on the other hand, the Arabic countries where it's more common maybe to walk around while showing your feet, then it's okay. It all depends. It has to be something that's offensive to the Gedolim in your location. That's the definition. You shouldn't be holding tefillin in your hand or sefer Torah in your arm while you're davening Shemoneh Esrei b'Shel Torah because then your mind is occupied with that. You shouldn't be holding money or object of a mispalu b'lulav. You can daven holding the lulav. That's the mitzvah of the day, so that's an exception. If there's something on your head and it came time to daven, if it's less than 4 kav, so just sort of send it back down your back. If it's bigger than that, I'll take it off and put it on the ground for those who used to carry things on their head. The sages, and they make sure that they're wrapped in their talis. Back then, that was the normal mode of dress. That was a respectful way of dressing, so you're wrapped in the talis. We also wrap ourselves in the talis. Of course, in Shulchan Aruch, you have the idea of the gartel, the belt, which of course we're very makbid on to a greater extent, not just having a belt, but to have a gartel. This is, of course, being careful not to say anything with an uncovered head. And many other halachas we don't have time really. It mentions in Shulchan Aruch, though, that once Siddurim became an object that was common, you could hold the Siddur, you could hold the machzer in your hand because it's helping you daven, so it's not distracting you, it's helping you. But it should be near you while you're davening. If you need to pick it up while you're davening, it should be right near you. And as you should mark in the Siddur where you need to. Okay, today it's easier or you're more familiar, but if you need to mark, you should mark in advance. You shouldn't be lost in the middle, flipping through pages. And if a sefer falls on the ground, you can pick it up if it's distracting you. Mil Shemoneh Esrei. Halacha Vav. A little quicker here. Taking a makom ketzad. Well, the location. Okay, Yamid makom namach. Stand in a low spot. You have to put him a kaisel, face the wall. You should open windows or doors facing Yerushalayim to face them while davening. It's a passing of Daniel that Daniel had the entrances in his attic towards Yerushalayim. When he davened, you should always have the same spot for where you're davening. You shouldn't be davening in some kind of hovel, broken down building, or behind the shul. Unless you're facing the shul. But if you're behind the shul, you're turning away, that's very offensive. Also, okay. But just after
the position he had was on his knees,
right,
with his hands clasped.
Right. So that's a topic as well that comes up when you're discussing this parak. Yes. So you can't sit near someone who's davening or pass in front of him until you're 4 amas away because of the shechina. You shouldn't be standing on an elevation of 3 tfachim, like a bed or a chair, not appropriate. If it's a very tall structure, if it has 4 by 4 amas, which is like the size of a room, then it's like its own attic. You could daven there, it's not a problem. If it has walls around it, even if it doesn't have 4 by 4, but you can daven because its height isn't noticeable. It's like you're in your own little bubble. Back to the workers who are on top of the wall of the tree. The Giyazman tefillah comes to davening. Here they have to come down, not like by Shema. Here they have to come down. And then they go back to work. If they're on the top of the olive tree or the fig tree, but then they daven where they are because it's too much of a hassle. It talks about it, it's going to affect their work or whatever. What are they davening? If they're only working for their food, they're not being paid a salary. They daven the whole Shemoneh Esrei. Being paid a salary, then they only daven the short middle bracha. And they certainly shouldn't be the chazan. They shouldn't be doing berachas kohanim. Halacha tes, and the Alter Rebbe talks about the shots could be on a higher spot if necessary, although the minig at that time is actually to go in a lower spot. Memakim. Halacha tes, hashvayas hakarol ketzad, modulating your voice like be a bit philosophy as well. Believe you shouldn't raise your voice or completely silent. You have to spell out the words with your lips and hear it quietly to your own ears. You shouldn't be raising your voice louder than that. Unless you're sick or you can't concentrate until you hear your voice, then it's okay. But as long as it's not publicly, people shouldn't be getting upset from the noise that you're making. There are more details. Al-Tabit talks about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Then you do raise your voice because people don't know the davening so well. Can't really get into that. We have to mamish finish it. Halacha Yud. Last 2. Kriya and Ashtachavaya. Kriya means bowing, regular bowing. That's what he refers to. The whole bowing is Kriya. You bow 5 times in every davening. The first bracha, beginning and end. And beginning and end. And at the end of davening, you bow, and you take these steps back while you're still bowing. When you turn to the left, you turn to your right, then you lift your head. And when you do that kriya for the 4 times earlier, baruch, you bow by baruch, shu zekef, when you go up, zekef Hashem. So here the Ram doesn't mention the concept of your knees and then bowing. It's just one bowing. Kriya means bowing. You bow by baruch and you're erect by Hashem. That's a regular guy. The Kohen Gadol actually by every bracha, beginning and end of each one, does a bow. And the king, when he bows at the beginning, he just keeps his head down the whole davening. He doesn't lift his head up. Why do we turn to the left first? Your left is the person facing you's right. So you imagine you're facing a king. So you're saying goodbye to the right of the king. To the left of the king. That's your left and your right. And they said you should leave davening the way you're saying goodbye to a king. It's like saying goodbye. You should really be bowing your back all the way down, so that way your whole it's like your back is like an accordion, basically. And if you bow a little bit, it looks like you're putting in the effort, and it's enough. You don't have to do more. What's prostration? Once you get up from the 5th bowing, you sit down on the ground and you put your face on the ground. The real nefilas apayim. Back then there was no set kapitel. You say whatever tachnunim you want. Kriya, and then the Ram defines Kriya. Kriya, when we say Kriya, we mean Albert Kaim, down on your knees. Kida al apayim. Kida means on your face. And Ishtachavaya is that pisha yadayim reglan. That's prostration, fully flat on the ground. Al shnim semutal upon al so your face is literally on the ground. You dag shoyes and nefilas panamach tefillin. You do nefilas apayim after davening. Yesh mishoyes akida. Yesh mishoyes Ishtachavaya. Some do it as a kida, as we described before, on your face, and some do it fully prostrated. Also, you can't do that on the stones except the base of English. And there, the Rama mentioned that there was a minute to put machzolos, to put straw out in the shoals. That way, you're not on the stones; you're on the straw. A respectful person can't do that. Unless he knows he's as tzaddik as Yeshua. A little bit on his face. You can daven here and fall over there. Last halacha minik pashut b'chol Yisrael. It's a minig everywhere. She'ein nefilas panim b'shabbasos v'meirlis l'b'rosh Hashanah l'b'rosh Chodashim. Chanukah purim v'mincha shel arba shabbos yom tevlim b'arba shb'chayim. They did what we call tachanun today. You don't do nefilas apayim when you don't say tachanun. Back then they didn't say tachanun, but that was they didn't do nefilas apayim. Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah, Purim, Mincha v'erev Shabbos and erev Yom Tov, Ma'ariv every day. Some did do nefilas apayim by Ma'ariv, but Yom Kippurim milbad. Knife them not playing Mechot Tefillah. Tefillah Yom Kippur is only day we do by every Tefillah B'nei Yom Tchina Wakal Shavatainus. That's the day where it's appropriate.
Amen.